So the last video we left off talking about primary groups, which again are these intimate, often informal groups that involve a lot of face-to-face interactions, a lot of very interconnectedness within these primary groups, and they help us establish a sense of who we are as an individual in the society that we're a part of. On the flip side of that, then we have secondary groups, which tend to be more formal than primary groups and often more impersonal. So these are the groups that maybe we're a part of, but we feel like we need to engage in a little bit of impression management when we're in our secondary groups. And oftentimes there's anonymous affiliations typically established around some commonality or to fulfill a need. So basically what that means is that these secondary groups, you might not necessarily know everyone, you might not necessarily interact with everyone that's in this secondary group, but you are collectively in this group together, even if you don't know everybody, because you all buy into whatever the group is organized around, right? So you buy into the norms that the group has established. You all share a common identity or a common trait that makes you part of this group. So an example could be, being in this intro to sociology class, right? That would be an example of a secondary group, right? You probably interact with each other, in your discussion forums in this class, you're interacting with one another. You may know some of your classmates by name, but you probably don't interact with them a whole lot outside of this class, right? You're all just here established around a common goal, in this case to complete this class, to earn the 3 credits that you will that this course is worth by the end of the semester, right? That's the commonality that this group is built around. Another example of secondary groups might be staff at a restaurant, right? Or your coworkers, wherever you work, You probably interact with those people, have water talk cooler, so to speak, Oh, hey, Bob, how was your weekend? What are you up to tonight after work? How is your wife and kids doing? Whatever. You have that small talk with, but the interactions are often less personal, right? You're probably not going up to your coworkers and divulging your deepest, darkest secrets to them about the problems that you're having with your significant other at home right now, right? You keep your interactions more formal and more professional often in these secondary groups because you don't know these people often as well as members of primary groups, for example. However, sometimes secondary groups can break down into primary groups. Sometimes what starts off as a secondary group can evolve into a primary group. So for example, maybe you become really close friends with 2 or 3 people that are in this intro to sociology class that you're currently taking, and you end up becoming a primary group of really close friends who are like-minded and enjoy sociology so much that you develop this really deep and meaningful friendship, and your interactions that once were impersonal and formal become more informal and intimate, developing you into a primary group. So groups can evolve, as anything within human society that involves social beings, right? They can constantly evolve. Another type of group is a reference group, which are the groups that we as individuals refer to when we're evaluating ourselves. We can also think of reference groups as the groups that we compare ourselves to, right? So another way to think about this is that before you make an important decision in your life, right? Maybe you're trying to decide, think about purchasing a car, or deciding whether or not you want to drop out of college, right? Making a big decision. Who do you think about in terms of what others would think about the decision that you're making, right? Odds are when you're making those decisions, you're not just thinking about what you want, you're thinking about, what would my friends think if I did this? What would my family think? Maybe what would members of my church or my religious group think? What would my professors think? What would members of my whatever group or organization I'm a part of think, right? And so those groups that you're thinking about, that are constantly evaluating your decisions about what others would think, those are reference groups, right? So all of us has reference groups, right? Whenever I make a really big decision, I think about, what my religion would think, I think about what my family would think, I think about, what if it's a professional decision I'm making with work, I think about what members of the professional organizations I'm a part of would think. So I'm referring to those other groups and trying to kind of anticipate what their response would be, and I use what I anticipate that I think they're going to say or would think to inform my own decisions and behaviors. Okay. In-groups are groups to which we feel a strong sense of belonging or closeness to. Our status as a member of what we consider to be an in-group is an integral part of who we are. So, for example, a vegan animal rights activist may consider PETA to be an in-group, right? It's a group that we feel a really strong sense of belonging or closeness to. Probably a primary group as well that we're a part of would likely be an in-group, but in-groups might be even more specific. Being a member of that group really provides an integral part of who we are. You might even consider your membership status for this of being of a particular in-group to be your master status. It might be that important to you, right? If being a member of PETA is the most important aspect of my identity that I use to navigate my pathways in life, then that might be my master status, right? That would be an in-group example for me. Outgroups are the opposite of that. They're the groups that we feel very disconnected from. We may even feel disdain or competition towards outgroups. So again, this is where group membership can cause some tension and cause some conflict if we feel so integrated and so much a part of a group and stand for what that group stands for in our individual lives. Then we're likely going to have some outgroups, which are like the opponents, if you will, or the competitors, groups that have very different ideologies than what our groups have. So an example, an avid deer hunter who eats meat every meal of the day would likely consider PETA to be an outgroup, right? Maybe you're a member of the National Rifle Association or, the Youth Hunters of America, and hunting and, eating meat is a really big part of your identity, you'd probably consider PETA, the animal rights activists, to be very much an outgroup, a group that you feel disdain or competitions toward, definitely a group that you feel strongly disconnected from. So let's talk a little bit about group leadership. In almost all groups, there's some sort of leadership position that gets created, and there's many different types of leaders that we as sociologists are interested in. There's instrumental leaders who tend to be very goal-oriented and largely concerned with accomplishing set tasks. So good examples of instrumental leaders are like CEOs of businesses. They can often be stereotyped as being kind of cold, right? And maybe not is very intimate with their interactions because they're just mainly concerned with accomplishing goals, right? Did we meet this mark? Did our sales meet what was expected for this quarter? Army generals or leaders in the armed forces are another examples of instrumental leaders. They're not really concerned with making you feel great about yourselves or incorporating individuals' input from the groups. They have set goals in mind that need to be accomplished, and all they care about is making sure that those goals get accomplished. Expressive leaders, on the other hand, are more concerned with the process of group formations and making decisions within the group. And expressive leaders tend to be more concerned with ensuring that everyone's emotional well-being is being taken care of. And like I said, that everyone kind of gets heard in these groups and in these organizations. So examples of expressive leaders could be religious leaders like rabbis or priests, etc. A director of a homeless shelter, for example, a director of a nonprofit, maybe, an organization or a group where you would expect that the process and that well-being of all members would be more appreciated, typically have expressive leaders versus instrumental leaders, which tend to be more goal-oriented and focused with accomplishing tasks at hand. There's also different leadership styles. So this last top we talked about types of group leadership, but there's also different styles that leaders can adopt. Democratic leaders, for example, are leaders who encourage group participation and consensus building before moving into action. So similar to expressive leaders, right, that are caring about the process, democratic leaders, very focused on getting all members of a group involved and being part of what is happening in that group or organization. Pros of democratic leadership is that they're often well-liked. Democratic leaders are often well-liked by members of the group because they try and incorporate everyone's thoughts and perspectives. And they emphasize a group consensus and participation. But a con of democratic leaders is that they can often be slow towards achieving progress in their groups and organizations because consensus building and making sure everyone's voice gets heard is a very time-consuming process, right? If you've ever heard the phrase of "there's too many cooks in the kitchen," that's often a problem that democratic leaders run into because when they're so concerned about making sure everyone feels heard, it can slow down the process of the group. Laissez-faire leaders are hands-off leaders who really allow the members of the group to make their own decisions, right? So if you kind of think of like the stereotypical leaders of like that you see in movies and on TV for like organizations like Google or Facebook, kind of like high tech firms where the leaders are kind of like, Steve Jobs-ish, where the idea or the mentality, the image that's painted up is that the leader of the organization, these laissez-faire leaders, just are kind of hands off and low key, like, hey, Joe, do whatever you want to do today. Susan, yeah, come up with something when you have a pitch ready, throw it by me, and we'll brainstorm from there. So they're really hands off. And this type of leadership can be really effective when group members are highly motivated and self-sufficient. So if you're working if all the members of your group kind of are like type A personalities and really don't need a lot of direction, this style of laissez-faire leadership can be really effective because a lot of people don't like to be micromanaged. They want to have more of a hands-off work environment where they can just work at their own pace and just have a leader there to bounce ideas off of as needed. A downfall to laissez-faire leaders is that it can result in group dissolution and a lack of progress if group members require more direction. So if your group members are types of people that really like step-by-step instructions or like leaders that are very hands-on and involved in the process, laissez-faire leaders might not be a great choice. The last type of leadership style we'll look at is authoritarian leaders, and these are leaders who issue orders and assign tasks. So authoritarian leaders are very much like instrumental leaders. They provide very clear goals and tasks to be completed by group members. They can be a little bossy or controlling and demanding. So the good thing about this is that if you're someone who really likes clear goals and expectations, you like to be told what to do, authoritarian leaders can be productive in that work environment. However, a downfall is that they can often alienate group members from a lack of expressive leadership. Authoritarian leaders often don't really care about the well-being of all the group members. They just tell them what to do and they expect it to get done. So the last thing we'll talk about here are coalitions. In some cases, group members may align themselves with others and form coalitions, which is an instance when two or more individuals from a group combine power and resources in order to achieve a mutual goal. So oftentimes coalitions are developed when they don't really agree with the leadership that's happening in the group organization, or maybe they just want to kind of form a separate entity or go a separate direction that the group currently isn't pursuing. So two or more members may coalesce and they form their own group, try and combine their power, combine their resources to achieve whatever goal it is that they're trying to achieve that the rest of the group isn't buying into. Coalitions can be permanent or they can be temporary. Sometimes members of a group will just form a minor coalition to address this one need that they think the whole group isn't addressing. And once they're able to satisfy that need or decide that there's no longer any point in pursuing that, they might dissolve their coalition and just go back to the main group. Other times, though, coalitions may start small and they may grow in strength and eventually break off from the group in its entirety. Coalitions often form in triads, because triads are the smallest group that a coalition could actually take place in, because it requires an instance when two or more people break off from the rest of the group. So triads are notorious for having coalitions form because when three people are working together, almost always one individual will try and rise to the position of being the leader, and then the other two individuals sometimes feel isolated or feel like they're being taken advantage of, and so those two other individuals may coalesce, they form a coalition on their own, and they may even end up breaking off from that triad and throwing out that third member who's trying to become the leader in the first place. So triads can be very unstable because, again, they're so small. They're one of the smallest sizes of groups of only 3 people, and oftentimes they experience coalitions where 2 people break off and then kick out the third member of that group.